Costing for overhead. Calculation of overhead or predetermined absorption rates. Behind a story of how Gardenia Muffin is price?
Yummy, it's Gardenia Muffin Supreme Chocolate. Wow, it's only RM 2.50.
But wait! Did you know how it made? What direct material used to produce muffin? How many direct labor involve? What are overhead costs?
Direct materials are those materials and supplies that are consumed during the manufacture of a product, and which are directly identified with that product. Think about the list of items you need to prepare a muffin. Your list will include items like flour, cocoa powder, sugar, eggs, milk, baking powder, etc. These items are none other than what companies and manufacturing organizations call direct material for preparing a muffin. Direct labor. Direct labor are costs that can be specifically and exclusively identified with a particular cost object. In this bakery, the bakers who mix the dough, bake the bread, and decorate the pastries are performing direct labor. They're directly involved in creating the goods that the bakery sells. Their wages, benefits, and any overtime pay they earn are all considered direct labor costs. The bakery would include these costs when calculating the cost of each loaf of bread or pastry they produce. Overhead. Overhead refers to the ongoing business expenses not directly attributed to creating a product or service. It is important for budgeting purposes, but also for determining how much a company must charge for its products or services to make a profit. Production overhead. Production overhead consists of indirect materials, indirect labor, and indirect expenses, which are incurred in a manufacturing process. Classification of overhead. Factory overhead includes all indirect costs incurred by the manufacturing department from the receipt of raw materials until the product is finished and placed in a saleable state until they are sold and delivered. Administration overhead includes all indirect costs incurred in directing and controlling general company policies and programs for the operation of the manufacturing and selling department of the enterprise. Selling and distribution overhead. Also known as general business overheads such as sales expenses, promotion, and the salesman's salaries. 4 steps for costing of overhead. First is allocation. Allocation. Allocation overheads refer to overhead costs that can be directly identified with a particular department or cost center. Allocation of overhead can be made only when the amount of overhead incurred by a particular department or cost center is known. 4 steps for costing of overhead. Second, apportionment. Apportionment. When an overhead could not be directly identified with a particular department or cost center, it needs to be apportioned. The apportionment requires each overhead costs to be distributed to all cost centers using appropriate basis of apportionment. Following the allocation and apportionment process, the total overhead costs for each department, production and service department, will be determined. These are the basis for overhead apportionment. 4 steps for costing of overhead. The third steps are reapportionment. Reapportionment. Service departments provide services to other departments in the organization. They do not work directly on producing the final product. Consequently, their costs must be reapportioned to production departments so that their overheads can be absorbed into the final product. In other words, since products do not pass through the service departments, the total overheads of the service department need to be reapportioned back to the production departments. Hence, after the reapportionment has been done, the total overheads for each production department can be determined. Methods of reapportionment. There are direct and continuous methods. This is an examples of overhead analysis sheet template. 4 steps for costing of overhead. The last one is absorption. Overhead absorption. After completing the overhead analysis sheet, the total production overhead costs for each production department is easily identified. The next stage is to absorb overheads to product cost. Overhead absorption is defined as charging the overhead costs to cost units using rates separately calculated for each cost center. Thus, we need to find overhead absorption rate, OAR. Types of overhead absorption rates, or. There are plant-wide OAR and departmental OAR. Let's look the methods for overhead absorption. There are several bases or methods available for the purpose of absorbing overheads to production departments. Common bases and the associated formula are shown below. Next is to determining overhead absorption. The amount of overhead absorbed to product can be calculated using the following formula.
Now let's calculate selling price of Gardenia Muffin Supreme. Every day, Gardenia produced 35,000 packs of Gardenia Muffin Supreme. The following data relates to the job.
Currently, Gardenia Muffin Supreme operates 3 production departments, mixing, molding and baking, and 2 service departments, packaging and maintenance. The budgeted overhead costs are as follows. This is an overhead analysis sheet for Gardenia Muffin. As you can see, overhead absorption rate, OR, for mixing department is 64 cents per machine hours, for molding department is 95 cents per machine hours and RM 2.21 per machine hours for baking department. This results comes after the process involved, which is allocation, apportionment and reapportionment. To determining overhead absorbed, total overheads is RM 25,000, total machine hours, MH, equals 10,000 hours, and for 1 unit of Gardenia Supreme Muffin it requires 5 hours of machine hours. Therefore overhead absorbed is at RM 12.50 per unit.
This is the final price. With the total cost of RM 69,672 for 35,000 unit muffin and with the margin of 20%, the selling price for 35,000 unit of Gardenia Muffin is RM 87,090. Therefore, price per unit of Gardenia Muffin chocolate is RM 2.50.